There has been a lot of recent talk about negative gearing in light of the current housing crisis in Australia. Negative gearing is a tax policy in Australia that allows property investors to offset losses from their rental properties against their taxable income, thereby reducing their overall tax liability. In this video, we'll break down the effects of this and other government policies have had on housing. Stick around to the end for the results. In simple terms, all expenditure for a rental property like mortgage interest, agent fees, insurance and so on is classified as a loss. If the rental income is less than the total expenditure, the balance becomes the loss amount and is deducted from the owner's taxable income. It was introduced in 1936 to encourage housing investment and increase supply for renters. Property investors buy from the same pool of housing as owner-occupiers, so the policy has to have some effect on the overall affordability of housing. This practice has been a subject of considerable debate, particularly recently with the housing supply and affordability crisis. Let's discuss this a little further using some key metrics and figure out if negative gearing is a good idea in today's market. Median house price to median income ratio. The house price to median yearly income ratio is a measure of housing affordability, indicating how many times the median income is required to purchase a median-priced house. Pre-negative gearing in the 1920s, specific data relating to house prices and incomes is quite limited. However, it's generally recognised that house prices were more affordable relative to incomes compared to later decades. For the 1930s, the median house price was 2 to 3 times the median income. During the Great Depression, house prices were relatively low, but incomes were also depressed. As the economy recovered towards the end of the 1930s, the ratio made it to around 2 or 3 to 1. For the 1940s, after World War II, housing was still relatively affordable, and there were government schemes encouraging home ownership for returning soldiers, and the ratio remained around 2 or 3. The 1950s post-war boom saw a rise in incomes, and housing was still relatively affordable as salaries increased with housing, at 2 to 3 times a yearly salary for a median-priced house. Australia saw a significant increase in home ownership during this time. In the 1960s, housing remained affordable, with the ratio moving to around 3. There was steady economic growth, and the population was increasing. In the 1970s, inflation and a growing population increased house prices slightly relative to income, but housing was still within reach for the average family. With the liberalisation of credit through the 1980s and higher demand for housing, prices began to outpace income growth, leading to a ratio approaching 5 by the end of the decade. The 90s saw further increase in our housing affordability index, rising to 5 to 6 times incomes with economic reforms, a more globalised economy, and a credit boom, all influencing house prices to climb faster than incomes. In the 2000s, a major housing boom occurred, especially in urban areas, and Australia reached house prices of 6 to 7 times yearly income. The ratio in cities like Sydney and Melbourne began to exceed 7, while in other regions it was slightly lower. The 2010s saw 7 to 8 times income. Housing affordability became a key issue. In cities like Sydney, the ratio reached 8 or higher, driven by high demand, foreign investment, and low interest rates. From 2020 to date, it is now 8 to 10 times income. The pandemic and low interest rates further fueled housing price increases, outpacing income growth. In some metropolitan areas, the ratio reached 10 or more, making housing increasingly unaffordable for many Australians. From 2020 to date, the median house price in Australia is 8 to 10 times median income. The pandemic and low interest rates further fueled housing price increases, outpacing income growth. In some metropolitan areas, the ratio reached 10 or more, making housing increasingly unaffordable for many Australians. As of 2024, the house price to median income ratio in cities like Sydney and Melbourne remains among the highest globally, reflecting substantial challenges in housing affordability in Australia. And how has rental price to median income tracked? The introduction of negative gearing should have an effect on rental affordability and availability because this was the reason for the introduction of this policy in the first place. Let's see how those numbers have tracked since. Before negative gearing is introduced, The 1920s saw a rent-to-income ratio around 10 to 15%. That's 10 to 15% of the median income is required to cover the median rent cost. The 1930s increased slightly to around 15 to 20%. This trend continued to the 1940s with rent-to-income at approximately 20 to 25%. The 1950s saw the rent-to-income ratio fall back to 15 to 20%. This was aided by government programs to increase home ownership, which meant fewer people rented long-term. This stayed about the same through the 60s, but rose back to 20 to 25% in the 1970s. The 80s and 90s had an average rent-to-income ratio of 20 to 30% as renting became more common, particularly for younger people. The next 3 decades is where the rise is more consistent. In the 2000s, the rent-to-income ratio is around 30 to 35% as rental demand increased due to population growth, especially from immigration, and housing shortages in key cities. Rental prices grew faster than incomes, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne. This has continued to date with a particularly sharp increase in the 2010s to get us to a current rent-to-income ratio of 35 to 45 to 45 to 45% of income. Rental vacancy rates indicate the percentage of available rental properties that are unoccupied, serving as a measure of housing supply and demand dynamics. A higher vacancy rate is good for renters as more properties are available and the prices reflect that by being more affordable. Finding detailed historical data on rental vacancy rates in Australia is challenging, as comprehensive records may not be available for the entire period. However, I can provide some insights based on available data and trends. Through the 1920s to the 1950s, sourcing detailed data is challenging as the rental market was less formalised. But from what we can tell, vacancy rates were likely higher due to less urbanisation and lower population density. It's possible that the introduction of negative gearing policy helped this. The first trend change is noted in the 80s and 90s where vacancy rates fluctuated with economic conditions. For example, the recession in the early 1990s saw higher vacancy rates due to economic downturns. In the 2000s, vacancy rates were relatively low, often around 2 to 3%, reflecting a growing population and increased demand for rental properties. This remained around there through the 2010s, with some fluctuations due to economic conditions and housing market changes. Recent data shows that vacancy rates have tightened significantly since 2020, with rates dropping to around 1 to 2% in many areas. This policy was introduced to increase availability and affordability for renters, but that hasn't proven to have worked over time. Owner-occupiers are also paying more since then. It's fair to say that negative gearing probably hasn't had the intended effect, and there must be other factors that have contributed to the current housing crisis in Australia. Is negative gearing policy a failure? A renter's alternative to buying their own home has progressively gotten worse too, as that market is getting more expensive. But I don't think we can say negative gearing has directly and solely caused this. Before we draw any conclusions about negative gearing creating the constant increase in house prices since inception, let's consider one of many other economic factors that contribute and the related government policies. In the 1930s, the percentage of women in the workforce in Australia was 20 to 25%. From the 60s to 2010, this increased rather linearly from 30% to around 65%. When that much extra income is injected into household budgets, there is more capital available when people bid for houses in the housing market. This has to put upward pressure on prices. Basic economics tells us that when demand is greater than supply, prices go up. Here's one last statistic. Since no-fault divorce was introduced in the 1970s, divorce rates have significantly increased. The trend for average adults per household has gone from 2.5 in the 1920s down to 2 in the 90s and just below 2 today. When a couple divorces and now requires 2 dwellings, there is an increase in demand for housing. Is the problem as simple as a supply issue? Well, yes. It's fair to say government policy and oversight with negative gearing. Immigration, incentivizing women into the workforce and making divorce easier have all contributed to the demand side in the housing market. Have governments in Australia done enough to encourage and enable supply? Obviously not. Proponents for negative gearing argue that it encourages investment in rental properties, increasing housing supply and providing more rental options. Opponents assert that negative gearing disproportionately benefits high-income earners and property investors, exacerbating income inequality and making housing less affordable for first-time buyers. Our research has shown that we're talking about the wrong thing if we think changing negative gearing policies will have much effect, if any, on the current housing crisis. Supply is clearly the problem. Thanks for listening to our discussion on this idea. See you next time.